Hey everyone, it's Justine from It's Just Paper, an exclusive line to CraftStash. Today I'm going to be showing you one of my favorite types of videos that I've done tons of times over on my channel, and I think you're going to love it. And those are techniques that I have forgotten about. There's so many techniques out there in crafting that oftentimes we forget about them. The ones that allow us to create simple and beautiful cards. So I want to show you 5 of those techniques in today's video. Let's get started. Alright, so for my first card today, I'm going to be using some ink blending on my background. Now, I'm going to use ink blending because I find you get more of a contrast and variety on your card. I can ink up the edges darker, work my way to the center, make that lighter. It's just a different contrast and tones to the card than using standard colored cardstock. But if you're not confident in ink blending or you don't have a lot of time, grab yourself a piece of colored cardstock. And if you do have a little bit of time, just ink up the edges in a darker color to get a little bit of contrast. That will give you a very similar look than the ink blended look that I'm doing here. Now I'm going to go ahead and grab this beautiful Shake Your Tail Feathers mandala stamp, which is my favorite out of the collection. I think it's absolutely stunning. And I am going to ink this up using some embossing ink or Versamark ink. Now, normally my go-to would be to reach for some gold or white embossing powder in this case, but I decided to switch things up and stop ignoring my clear embossing powder. This is going to give me some shine and texture to the card without overpowering it as my focal point. Now I'm going to add some fine detail clear embossing powder. I think that's important to say that you need super fine or fine for this just because it's such a detailed stamp. If you use regular embossing powder, you'll get a similar look, but it might not look as crisp and clean. If you are going to use white embossing powder, here's a look as to what that would look like. It's also equally beautiful. So I'm going to stamp this onto my cardstock here once it's all dry. Be sure to hit it with a heat tool before doing this to make sure that the inks are dry before you do this, or you're going to make a mess and have embossing powder everywhere. I added the clear embossing powder on top, and I'm just going to melt it. And you'll see that it gives you a monochromatic look. Here's more of a better look at it. And it really is beautiful. Adds some shine, some detail to the card. I finished it off by embossing a sentiment in gold embossing powder and adding some gold accents with pearls and cardstock to the card. And I mounted this onto a white card base so that the white would help make the colors pop even more and make this card even more beautiful. You may notice, however, that my paper trimmer needs some new blades and I have some fuzzies. So here's a little tip for you. If you grab an X-Acto knife and run it along the edges ever so lightly so that you don't scratch up your card or cut your cardstock, it will remove all of these fuzzies and you can move on with your day without having to recreate the card. One final look at the card here, you'll see the beautiful design that it created, and here is it photographed where you can see it in a different light just to see how beautiful that is. For my next card, my go-to once again when it comes to stamping is to stamp in a solid color or to heat emboss with the stamp. And that can get a little bit boring as well, so I decided to grab a blending tool here and ink up the stamp in various areas and stamp it onto my card. Now, I'm not doing this directly with my ink pad because I would get the harsh edges of where the ink pad ends. You can go direct ink pad to your stamp, but grab one of these makeup sponge or one of these foam blending tools here and just soften up the edges by dabbing on top of it, and that will give you a great look as well. But I'm going to essentially ink blend on top of my stamp, and between each color I'm going to clean off my stamp. And this does require obviously some sort of stamping tool, so you could always be stamping in the same spot. And I'm going to ink this up in a variety of colors. Now the key is here though, once you're done adding your colors, do not remove the stamp because we're going to take one extra step to add some more detail to this feather. I always push the cardstock back up into the corner to make sure that the paper hasn't shifted. I do find that even with magnets, sometimes your cardstock can shift, which is why I don't bother with magnets, and I always just get in the habit of pushing it back into the corner when I'm done. So adding each color here, and the nice thing about the colors that I'm using, which are a dark teal, purple, and blue, is that when they're stamped on top of each other, they generally go well together. They're not going to make a muddy brown. I do try, however, to ink up in various areas of the stamp that haven't already been inked yet. Now, if you don't like the look, you can start over again, just an FYI. The reason why I started over on this particular card is because I didn't dry off my stamp well enough and it ended up not getting a crisp stamp, but more of a watercolor look, which is a great look in itself, but not the look I was going for this particular card. Now, once I finished stamping everything, I did not remove the stamp. I decided to go over it with some clear embossing powder after I had cleaned my stamp. You want to clean your stamp first because you don't want your embossing pad to get all dirty. And I'm going to stamp over top of all of these colors. I decided to add a embossing powder that is a sparkly embossing powder, but it is clear. So it's not going to affect the image of the stamp at all, but it's going to add some glittery look to it without getting the mess of the glitter. This particular one is Wanderlust from Catherine Pooler, which I believe is retired, but there's plenty out there, and if I happen to find one, I will link to it in the video description. Is this step absolutely necessary? No, but it makes my stamping more versatile, more fun, more diverse, and it just gives me an extra thing that I can do with my ink pads and my stamps that makes me stretch my supplies even further. To finish up this particular card, I grabbed a piece of holographic cardstock. I added a little strip onto my cards and then simply added a sentiment over top. And you'll see both of my designs, the one that I messed up and the one that I didn't. The area that I messed up happened to be at the bottom of the feather, so I was able to just cover it with the sentiment and still use it. Here is a look at the final cards themselves. You can just see how sparkly they are, how beautiful they are when you hold them up to the light. So fun. All right, let's move on to the next technique. So the next technique here, I'm going to be using an ink blended background like I did at the very beginning of the tutorial on my first card. I actually messed this one up, so I decided to just continue using it. And so why not have any waste? You can see that I did stamp on it. I added my powder to it and it got everywhere because I didn't let my background dry. So I wiped off all the powder and was able to salvage it for this card. Now I'm going to be using a 3D Peacock embossing folder here, and I'm going to run this through my die cutting machine. Now what you will notice when I remove it is it's different than a standard embossing folder. It's a 3D embossing folder. So it's not just adding texture to the card, but it's adding textures in a variety of dimensions. So it's not all just one layer of dimension, but a variety of layers. Here you can see how beautiful that image is and how gorgeous it is with that textured background of stamping the mandala stamp in some clear ink on an ink blended background and then running it through with the embossing folder. I'm grabbing a piece of sandpaper now and I'm just going over it ever so lightly, rubbing it over top of the peacock to kind of distress it and bring out some of the white core of the cardstock. This is optional, gives it a little bit more of a vintage look, but I love it. So feel free to give it a try. It's one of those techniques I often forget about. Here is another technique that I often forget about, and that's using my frame dies here, my nesting dies, to create a little bit of dimension with the cardstock and a little bit of detail that doesn't make things difficult at all. So I'm going to grab two of the rectangles and I'm going to tape them together so that they're evenly spaced apart. I'm going to run them through my die cutting machine using this background as well as a piece of gold cardstock rather. This is going to give me the background, the peacock background that is relatively undisturbed, but then two teal frames. It's also going to give me a large piece of gold and two gold frames in this. And what I'm going to do is interchange them and layer them all together so that I get a nice gold frame, but it keeps everything one layer. Feel free to add dimension to this as well by adding things with foam tape, or a piece of cardboard if you don't have foam tape can go on the back of this to give it a little bit of pop. All right, you can see the final look of this card. Very subtle background, vintagey, mixed media, love it. All right, for the next technique, it's not necessarily a technique I forgot about. It's a technique I forgot to try, but I've seen it many times. So I'm going to grab this peacock feather die and I'm going to run it through my card panel. I am strategically placing it though, so it's not directly in the center, but more towards the left of the card. And this is done on purpose, and you'll see why in just a moment when we begin to complete the card. I'm going to save both pieces, the card frame that I'm using, which is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I'm also going to save the feather die cut that comes out of this. I'm going to set those pieces off to the side, and now I'm going to work directly on a card base. So this is already a folded card base, and I'm going to grab those three colors I've been using throughout the entire series, some dark blue, dark purple, and dark turquoise, and I'm just going to ink up where the feather will be. I can go ahead and check at any time to make sure that I am inking enough of the areas, and I can go ahead and add any ink as I see. If you would like to add more texture to this, you can go over top of it with that mandala stamp. You can white emboss it, you can clear emboss it, you can run it through with the embossing folder. It's completely up to you, but I'm going to leave it just plain with the ink blending. And I'm going to glue this directly on top of the card base. However, I am going to make sure that I am gluing down some of these little details in here, because I know for a fact that if you run your hand over the card, if you don't glue down these little pieces, then they could rip. This is a great way to practice your ink blending on this card as well because it's such a small area. It doesn't matter if you screw up, you won't notice because it's such a, the feather stamp will distract from any imperfections. Next up, I'm going to glue the white feather here, and I'm going to glue it directly onto the card base as well, but I'm going to center it off of the feather that I've already created. So I'm using all the pieces of my die cutting here, and this is just so beautiful. I saw this on Pinterest and had to recreate it. I topped it off with a sentiment that says, "Shake your tail feather, it's your birthday," which is super cute and fun and sort of peppy. You can add this with foam tape or glue, whichever you prefer. Here is one final look at the card, super stunning. The next one is more of a product that I always forget to take out and use, and it's so much easier than ink blending. Now I ink blended my background using blue. Again, you can go ahead and grab yourself a piece of cardstock if you prefer. And there are actually two things that I forgot about in this video that I never seem to take out often enough. These are some gold watercolors, and I'm just going to wet them here to make them, to activate them. And I'm just grabbing my paintbrush and just tapping on the paintbrush and adding some gold splatters to the card. I always seem to forget splatters on my card, and they look absolutely beautiful, whether you're splattering gold or silver, or you just grab a color that you used on your card and splatter the background with it. It's a perfect way, especially when creating on white card bases, to add a little bit of extra detail without taking away from your focal point. Now I went ahead and I die cut a few of these feathers that I used in the previous card, so I'm going to cut out 3 feathers in total. And I just grabbed a shopping bag here, and I'm just put the die cuts in here so I can contain the mess. And I'm using some Distress Oxide sprays, and I'm going ahead and spraying my feather die cuts. Instead of going and trying and ink blending them, adding sprays just makes it really quick, the process. The only thing is, doing it inside a box or a bag like this is definitely helpful to avoid any mess. And it doesn't matter if you use Distress sprays or Distress Oxide sprays or any other brand for that matter. So you can see here I have my feathers. They're already done and they're super quickly inked. This is perfect if you decide to add color to a die cut like this one that's quite delicate, but you forgot. So ink blending would go in and probably tear the die cut, but sprays makes them really great to add color without damaging them. So I'm going to go ahead and glue these onto my cardstock. Any feathers that are hanging off the edge, I'm going to trim them, and I am going to use these pieces to fill in any sort of gaps on my card panel. You can see me filling in those gaps here. The only thing is you have to kind of be strategic about the placement so that it doesn't look like they're cut off randomly. So you can see I have the ends of the feathers going into the center and the pieces I've cut at the edges of the card. Next up, I just swiped my ink pad onto some cardstock, and I trimmed my sentiment here so that the ink color or the color of the cardstock would match the inked background. Now, if you decide to create any of these cards using these techniques, please tag us at CraftStash. I'd be happy to see what you've created after being inspired by this video. See you again soon.